You're nothing but a burden, dragging me down with your small life. He spat, his voice dripping with venom as he embraced his boss in the hospital room doorway, abandoning his black wife in the throes of labor. As a brilliant black entrepreneur and visionary behind a monumental community investment fund, she gripped the bed rails, sweat streaming down her face, enduring not just the pain of childbirth, but the sting of betrayal and racial prejudice. From dismissive glances to cutting remarks about her place, she's faced injustice at every turn, yet her strength shines through. Will she rise above the heartbreak and reclaim her power? Join us to uncover her journey of triumph. Don't miss out. Subscribe to catch our latest stories and share where you're tuning in from. Stay hooked to see how resilience rewrites her story. The summer storm battered New Orleans with a vengeance, its thunder roaring like a beast unleashed, each clap shaking the hospital's glass windows as if they might shatter. Rain hammered relentlessly, 1,000 nails pounding against the panes, drowning out the hum of machines in delivery room 312. Inside, a black woman in her early 30s gripped the cold metal rails of the hospital bed, her knuckles paling under the strain. Her curly hair, usually neatly coiled, clung to her sweat-drenched forehead in damp strands. Her eyes, sharp and resolute despite the exhaustion, flickered with pain as another contraction ripped through her. She was a force, a visionary entrepreneur who had spent months weaving a web of secret deals to birth a $75 billion community investment fund. Yet here she was, alone in her struggle, her breath ragged and sharp. Her husband, a white man in his mid-30s, stood by the window, his tailored suit pristine despite the chaos outside. His face, handsome but cold, was lit by the glow of his phone, his thumbs dancing across the screen with a focus that excluded her entirely. Another contraction seized her, and she gasped, her voice trembling as she called out to him. "Please, I need you." Her words were a fragile thread, woven with desperation and hope, but they fell on deaf ears. He didn't look up, didn't move, his attention locked on the device in his hands. The air in the room grew heavier, the storm outside mirroring the one brewing within her. She tried again, her voice breaking as the pain surged. "I can't do this alone." Her plea hung in the space between them, but he sighed, a sound laced with impatience, as if her labor was an inconvenience. "Just breathe, okay? You'll be fine," he muttered, his tone flat, dismissive. His eyes never left the screen, where a new message flashed, the name unmistakable, his boss, the CEO of a luxury fashion empire, a woman whose wealth and influence radiated through every tailored suit and calculated smile. The kind of woman who made men like him feel they could trade up, leave behind the ordinary for something glittering. The nurse, a middle-aged white woman with kind but weary eyes, adjusted the monitors and shot him a pointed look. "Sir, she's in active labor. She needs your focus, not your phone." Her voice carried a quiet reprimand, but he barely acknowledged her, offering a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm focused," he said, his words hollow. "Just handling something quick." The nurse's lips tightened, but she turned back to her patient, her hands steady as she checked the monitors. Another contraction hit, and the woman on the bed bit back a cry, her body arching against the pain. Her husband's indifference cut deeper than the physical agony, a betrayal that twisted in her chest like a knife. She caught a glimpse of the phone screen as another message lit it up. The name glowed again. His boss. Her heart sank, a sickening realization creeping in. She knew that name, had heard it in passing conversations, seen the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of her power, her elegance. The woman who seemed to embody everything he craved. Status, wealth, a world beyond the one they'd built together. Another message buzzed, and his posture shifted. He straightened, a faint smile tugging at his lips, a smile she hadn't seen directed at her in months. Her mind raced, the pain of labor blurring with the ache of suspicion. Who was texting him now, when she needed him most? "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. But before she could say more, he turned toward the door, his movements abrupt. "I need to make a call," he said, his tone clipped. She stared, disbelief warring with the pain coursing through her. "You can't leave now," she said, her voice rising. sharp with desperation. The nurse stepped forward, her expression stern. "Sir, she's progressing fast. You could miss the birth." But he was already moving, his hand on the door. Then in a moment that froze the room, he turned, his arm slipping around the silhouette of a woman standing just outside. A sleek figure in a tailored coat, her presence commanding even in shadow. His boss. "You're nothing but a burden, dragging me down with your small life," he spat, his voice low but venomous, each word a dagger aimed at his wife's heart. The cruelty of it landed like a blow, her breath catching as the sting of his betrayal mingled with the physical pain. The nurse gasped softly, her eyes wide with shock, but he didn't falter, his embrace tightening around the other woman as they stepped out of sight. The door swung shut with a heavy thud, leaving the room suffocatingly silent except for the storm's relentless drumming. She gripped the bed rails tighter, her nails digging into her palms as another contraction surged, this one so fierce it stole her breath. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. The nurse rushed to her side, her voice gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, you're doing incredible. Focus on you and that baby." The words were meant to comfort, but there was an undercurrent, a subtle assumption that she, a black woman, was built to endure this kind of pain, physical and emotional, alone. "You're strong," the nurse added, her tone almost patronizing, as if strength was all she was expected to have. The woman on the bed nodded, her jaw clenched. She was strong, but not because she had to be, because she chose to be. Her mind flashed to the months of late-night calls, the secret meetings, the careful negotiations she'd hidden from her husband. He'd mocked her dreams, called them too big for someone like her, his words laced with a condescension that now echoed in his betrayal. But she'd done it. The notification on her phone, locked away in a secure app, burned in her memory. The $75 billion deal was hers, a community investment fund that would change lives, a legacy she'd built in the shadows while he chased a shinier prize. The storm outside raged on, the thunder a primal roar that seemed to echo her resolve. She breathed through the pain, each inhale a defiance, each exhale a promise to her unborn child. The nurse adjusted the monitors, her hands steady but her glance fleeting, as if she couldn't quite meet the intensity in her patient's eyes. "You've got this," the nurse said, but the woman barely heard her. Her focus was inward, on the life she was bringing into the world and the strength she'd need to carry them both forward. The door remained closed, her husband's absence a wound that pulsed with every contraction. But as the pain peaked, so did her clarity. She didn't need him. Not now, not ever. The storm could rage, the world could judge, but she was a force of her own, unyielding and unbreakable. The thunder cracked again, and she gripped the rails, ready to face whatever came next, her heart a fortress against the betrayal that had tried to break her. If you're gripped by this story, don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to our channel for the latest episodes and share where you're tuning in from. How will she turn this betrayal into triumph? Stay with us to find out. The storm outside the New Orleans hospital raged on, its fury a relentless drumbeat against the windows of delivery room 312, where the air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the electric tension of impending birth. The black woman, her early 30s marked by a quiet ferocity, lay on the hospital bed, her body racked by the relentless grip of labor. Her curly hair, matted with sweat, framed a face etched with both pain and an unyielding resolve. Her hands, no longer clutching the bed rails, now rested on her swollen belly, fingers trembling as she braced for the next contraction. The absence of her husband, who had stormed out moments ago with a venomous insult and another woman's arm around him, left a void that pulsed with betrayal. Yet in that void, something fiercer burned, a secret she'd guarded with meticulous care, a triumph that would redefine her. The room was a cocoon of chaos and calm, the monitors beeping in a steady rhythm, their green lines spiking with each contraction. The nurse, a white woman with graying hair and a practiced gentleness, hovered nearby, adjusting a drip with deft hands. Her eyes flicked to her patient, a mix of pity and admiration in her gaze, as if she saw a warrior but assumed the battle was one of endurance rather than choice. "You're doing so well, honey," she said, her voice soft but tinged with an unspoken assumption. that a black woman like her was built to withstand such trials. The words, meant as comfort, carried a subtle weight, a reminder of the world's expectations that she should simply endure. But she was more than endurance. Beneath the pain, beneath the sting of her husband's words, "You're nothing but a burden, dragging me down with your small life," she harbored a truth he'd never grasped. Her phone, tucked on the side table, held the key to a victory he'd dismissed as impossible. Between the waves of agony, she reached for it, her movements slow but deliberate, her fingers steady despite the tremors. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow across her face as she navigated to a secure app. Its interface sleek and unassuming, a fortress for her ambition. A notification blinked. Contract finalized. $75 billion community investment fund secured. Her breath caught, not from pain, but from the weight of what she'd achieved. Months of clandestine work flashed through her mind. Late nights in their modest apartment, when her husband thought she was merely tinkering with spreadsheets, she'd been on calls with global philanthropists, negotiating with corporate titans, and drafting proposals that would reshape communities. She'd hidden it all, not out of deceit but necessity. His mockery had been a constant, his belief that her dreams were too big for someone like you, a chain she'd refused to wear. Each deal, each handshake, each signed contract had been a brick in the foundation of a legacy she'd built alone. The fund, designed to uplift marginalized voices, was her monument, and now it was real. Another contraction surged, pulling her back to the present. She gritted her teeth, her body tensing as the pain clawed through her. The nurse was at her side in an instant, her voice a soothing anchor. "Breathe through it, sweetheart. You're almost there." But the woman's mind was a storm of its own, not just of pain but of clarity. She saw her husband's face, his cold dismissal, the way he'd clung to his boss as if she were his ticket to a better world. She saw the years of subtle slights, his colleagues' raised eyebrows when she attended his work events, their murmurs about how surprising it was that she carried herself so well. The world had tried to box her in, to define her by her skin, her gender, her supposed limits. But she'd shattered those boxes, and this moment, this pain, was her crucible. The phone slipped from her hand, landing softly on the bed. She didn't need to read the message again. The words were seared into her. $75 billion, a sum that would echo across industries, a testament to her vision. She'd done it without him, without his faith, without his approval. The realization steadied her, a quiet fire kindling in her chest. She wasn't just surviving this labor. She was birthing more than a child. She was birthing a future, one where her son would know a mother who defied the odds, who turned betrayal into fuel. The nurse noticed the shift in her expression, a fleeting spark of triumph amid the strain. "You're a tough one," she said, her tone warm but edged with that same assumption. That toughness was her only currency. The woman met her gaze, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion. "I'm more than tough," she said, her voice low but steady, a declaration to herself as much as to the room. The nurse blinked, caught off guard, then nodded as if sensing something deeper beneath the surface. The storm outside seemed to pause, the rain softening to a steady patter, as if the world itself was catching its breath. Another contraction came, sharper than before, and she channeled the pain into focus, her mind racing through the faces of those she'd convinced, the skeptics she'd silenced. She remembered the boardroom in Chicago, where a white executive had leaned back, smirking, and said, "It's ambitious, but are you sure you're the right face for this?" She'd smiled then, her response measured but cutting, dismantling his doubt with facts and figures. That deal had been the cornerstone of her fund, and now it was done. Her fingers curled into the sheets, anchoring her as the pain peaked. She thought of her son, the life she'd promised him in whispered vows during sleepless nights. He would grow up knowing a mother who didn't just endure, but conquered. The monitors beeped faster, the nurse's movements quickening as the labor intensified. "You're close now," the nurse said, her voice urgent but calm. "Keep going." The woman nodded, her lips pressed tight, her mind a fortress against the memory of her husband's betrayal. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in with each surge of pain, but she felt larger, as if her spirit could outmatch the storm itself. She didn't need him here, didn't need his hand to hold or his hollow reassurances. She had herself, her son, and a legacy that would outshine his fleeting ambition. The nurse's voice broke through again, softer this time. "You're doing something amazing, you know that?" The woman didn't respond, but her eyes burned with a truth the nurse couldn't fully grasp. Amazing wasn't enough. She was unstoppable. As the next contraction loomed, she closed her eyes, letting the notification's words replay in her mind. $75 billion secured. It was her secret, her shield, her sword. The world might see a black woman in labor, alone and betrayed, but she saw a titan, forging a path through pain and prejudice. The storm outside roared once more, a final defiant clap of thunder, and she breathed deep, ready for the battle ahead, knowing she'd already won the war. Don't miss what happens next in this gripping tale. Subscribe to our channel for the latest chapters, and let us know where you're tuning in from. Can she turn this moment of heartbreak into a legacy of power? Stay with us to find out. The storm over New Orleans had not relented, its relentless downpour battering the hospital's windows. Each gust of wind a howl that seemed to echo the turmoil within delivery room 312. The air inside was thick with the sharp tang of antiseptic and the electric hum of monitors, their screens casting a clinical glow across the room. The black woman, her early 30s a testament to resilience, lay on the bed, her body locked in the throes of labor. Her curly hair, now a damp halo, framed a face taut with effort, her dark eyes burning with a resolve that refused to waver. The pain was a tidal wave, each contraction crashing through her, but it was the absence of her husband that carved the deepest wound. His cruel words, "You're nothing but a burden, dragging me down with your small life," still echoed, a venomous lash that stung as fiercely as the labor itself. Nearly an hour had passed since he'd stormed out, his arm around his boss, a woman whose wealth and influence had lured him away from his wife's side. The silence he left behind was heavier than the storm outside, a void filled only by the rhythmic beeping of the machines and the nurse's steady presence. The nurse, a white woman with gray-streaked hair and a quiet strength, moved with practiced efficiency, checking the monitors and offering a gentle touch to her patient's shoulder. "You're holding up like a champion," she said, her voice warm but carrying a faint undertone, as if she assumed this woman's endurance was a given, a trait expected of someone who looked like her. The words, though kind, landed like a subtle jab, a reminder of the world's tendency to see her strength as inevitable rather than chosen. The woman on the bed barely registered the comment, her focus split between the physical agony and the emotional wreckage her husband had left in his wake. Her hands, no longer gripping the rails, now pressed against her belly, as if shielding the life within from the betrayal unfolding beyond these walls. The storm's roar seemed to amplify her thoughts, each thunderclap a punctuation to the memory of his departure. She could still see him in the doorway, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the chaos of the moment, his arm around the sleek figure of his boss, a woman whose power he craved more than the family he'd vowed to cherish. His words had been a blade, slicing through years of shared promises, and the image of his exit burned in her mind like a brand. Another contraction surged, fiercer than the last, and she clenched her jaw, stifling a cry. The nurse was at her side instantly, her hands steady as she adjusted the drip. "You're getting closer, sweetheart. Just keep breathing." But breathing felt like a betrayal of the rage simmering within her. She didn't want to breathe through this. She wanted to roar, to let the world know that she was more than the small life he'd dismissed. Her mind flickered to the secret she'd guarded, the $75 billion community investment fund she'd secured through months of relentless work. It was a triumph he'd never believed her capable of, a dream he'd mocked as beyond her reach. That secret was her anchor now, a lifeline in this storm of pain and abandonment. The door creaked open, and her heart lurched, a fleeting hope that he'd returned, that he'd seen the error of his ways. But when she looked up, it was him, her husband, stepping back into the room, his hair damp from the rain, his suit slightly rumpled, but his demeanor unnervingly calm. No urgency, no remorse, just a cold composure that chilled her more than the storm outside. He didn't rush to her side, didn't offer a word of apology. Instead, he stood at the foot of the bed, his hands in his pockets, his eyes avoiding hers. The nurse paused, her expression tightening as she sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere. "Sir, she's in critical labor," she said, her tone sharp. But he ignored her, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond his wife's pained face. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady, rehearsed, as if he'd practiced this moment in the rain-soaked hour he'd been gone. She stared at him, her breath hitching as another contraction loomed, her body screaming while her heart braced for what was coming. "Talk?" she managed, her voice raw, barely above a whisper. "I'm giving birth to our child." But he pressed on, undeterred, his words cutting through the beeping monitors and the storm's distant rumble. "This marriage is over. I can't keep living like this, tied to a life that's going nowhere. She understands me. We're getting married." The room seemed to freeze, the air sucked out by the weight of his declaration. The nurse stepped back, her eyes wide, caught between shock and the need to stay professional. The woman on the bed felt her heart stutter, not from the pain of labor, but from the finality of his betrayal. She could only mean his boss, the woman who'd lured him away with promises of power and prestige, the one he'd chosen over the family they'd built, over the child she was bringing into the world. "You're leaving me now," she said, her voice trembling, but laced with steel. "In this room, while I'm fighting to give life to our son." He shifted, his jaw tightening, but his eyes remained cold, detached. "I'll take care of the kid financially," he said, as if that absolved him. "But I need more. She can give me a life you can't." The words were a slap, each syllable dripping with a condescension that reeked of prejudice, as if her blackness, her ambition, her very existence were obstacles to his greatness. She saw it then, the truth he'd hidden behind polite smiles and half-hearted vows. He'd always seen her as less, as someone who could never match the glittering world he craved. The nurse's face hardened, but she stayed silent, her hands hovering over the monitors as if grounding herself in her work. The woman on the bed felt the next contraction building, but it was the pain in her chest that threatened to break her. She looked at him, searching for a trace of the man she'd loved, but found only a stranger, his ambition a mask for his cowardice. "Go," she said, her voice low, steady, a command forged in the fire of her resolve. "If you walk out now, that door stays closed forever." He hesitated just for a moment, his eyes flickering with something, regret perhaps, or doubt, but it passed as quickly as it came. Without a word, he turned, the door swinging shut behind him, with a finality that echoed louder than the thunder. The storm outside roared, but inside she felt a strange calm settle over her. The pain of labor was hers to bear, but so was her strength, her victory, her future. She closed her eyes, letting the monitor's steady rhythm anchor her, knowing that the secret she carried, the $75 billion legacy she'd built, would outshine his betrayal. The nurse touched her arm, her voice soft but urgent. "You're stronger than he'll ever know. Let's get you through this." The woman nodded, her lips pressed tight, her heart a fortress. The storm could rage, but she would not break. She was ready, for her son, for herself, for the world she'd reshape. Don't miss the next chapter of this electrifying story. Subscribe to our channel for the latest updates and share where you're tuning in from. How will she rise from this betrayal? Stay with us to uncover her triumph. The storm over New Orleans had begun to relent, its once ferocious roar softening to a low grumble, the rain now a steady drizzle against the hospital's windows. In delivery room 312, the air was heavy with the sterile bite of antiseptic and the rhythmic pulse of monitors, their green lines charting the relentless march of labor. The black woman, in her early 30s, a testament to unyielding spirit, lay on the bed, her body a battlefield where pain and resolve collided. Her curly hair, slick with sweat, clung to her face, framing eyes that burned with a fierce determination despite the exhaustion etching her features. The sting of her husband's betrayal, his cruel words, his arm around his boss as he abandoned her, lingered like a bruise, but it was the life stirring within her that anchored her now. She was no longer just a woman scorned. She was a mother on the cusp of creation, a visionary whose secret triumph waited in the wings. The nurse, a white woman with gray-flecked hair and a quiet strength, moved with a calm urgency, her hands deft as she adjusted the monitors. Her eyes, soft with empathy, met her patient's, but there was a subtle weight in her gaze, an assumption that this woman's endurance was a given, a trait carved into her by the world's expectations. "You're so close now," the nurse said, her voice a gentle tether amidst the chaos. "You're doing this like a warrior." The words meant to uplift carried an unspoken edge, as if her strength was not a choice but a necessity, a burden placed on her because of who she was. The woman on the bed registered the tone, but let it pass, her focus locked on the task ahead, her heart tethered to the child she was bringing into the world. Another contraction surged, a tidal force that arched her back and stole her breath. She gripped the sheets, her knuckles whitening, her jaw clenched to stifle a cry. The pain was a crucible, forging her anew with each wave. Her mind flickered to the moment her husband had walked out, his venomous words, "You're nothing but a burden, dragging me down with your small life," echoing like a cruel refrain. But she was not small. She was vast, her ambition a constellation of dreams he'd never bothered to see. Tucked away in her mind was the secret that fueled her now. A $75 billion community investment fund, secured through months of clandestine negotiations, a legacy she'd built in the shadows while he chased a shinier illusion. That knowledge was her shield, her defiance against the betrayal that sought to diminish her. The nurse's voice broke through, steady and encouraging. "Push when you feel it, sweetheart. You're almost there." The woman nodded, her breath coming in sharp, measured bursts. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as the labor intensified, but she felt herself expanding, her spirit growing larger than the pain, larger than the absence of the man who'd vowed to stand by her. She thought of her son, the boy she'd named in quiet moments, whispering promises to him in the dark. Malik. A name that carried weight, a name that would know a mother who defied the world's attempts to confine her. The monitors beeped faster, their rhythm a counterpoint to the storm's fading growl. The nurse leaned closer, her hands ready, her voice a calm beacon. "You're doing it. Just a little more." The woman's eyes closed for a moment, her mind flashing to the battles she'd fought to reach this point. The late-night calls in a cramped apartment, the skeptical glances from boardroom executives who saw her skin before her vision, the whispered doubts that she was reaching too high. One memory stood out, a meeting in Atlanta, where a white investor had leaned forward, his smile patronizing, and said, "This is a bold plan, but are you sure you're the one to lead it?" She'd met his gaze, her response a quiet blade, dismantling his prejudice with data and conviction. That deal had sealed her fund, and now it was done. The pain surged again, a relentless force that demanded everything. She pushed, her body trembling with effort, her mind a fortress against the memory of her husband's departure. She saw him in the doorway, his arm around his boss, a woman whose wealth he'd chosen over their family. She saw the coldness in his eyes, the way he'd dismissed her as if she were nothing. But she was everything. She was the architect of a future he'd never imagined. A woman who'd turned his doubt into her victory. The nurse's voice grew urgent. "One more, come on, you've got this." The woman pushed again, a primal force rising within her, her body and soul aligned in a singular purpose. And then a cry pierced the room, not hers but her son's. The sound was a miracle, a sharp, clear note that cut through the storm's last echoes. The nurse lifted the baby, his tiny body slick and perfect, his eyes wide and searching. "It's a boy," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she placed him in his mother's arms. The woman looked down, her breath catching as she met her son's gaze. Malik. His tiny hand curled around her finger, and in that moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The betrayal, the pain, the storm, they all faded, dwarfed by the weight of this new life. She traced his cheek, her touch gentle but fierce, a vow unspoken. "It's you and me now, Malik," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill. I'll show you what it means to be strong, to be true. The nurse stepped back, giving her space, but her words lingered, soft and well-meaning, but tinged with that same assumption. You're built for this, aren't you? Such a fighter. The woman didn't respond, her focus locked on her son, his warmth grounding her. She wasn't built for this. She'd chosen it, forged it, claimed it. The room was quiet now, the monitor's beep softening, the storm outside reduced to a whisper. She held Malik close, her heart swelling with a love that eclipsed the pain of the past hour. Her husband's absence was a shadow, but it no longer loomed. She thought of the fun, the $75 billion legacy she'd crafted in secret, a beacon for communities like the one she'd grown up in. She thought of the years of slights, neighbors who'd called her articulate as if it were a surprise, colleagues who'd assumed she'd never rise above her station. She'd proven them wrong, and she'd prove it again, for Malik, for herself. The nurse adjusted the blanket around the baby, her smile genuine but fleeting. You're a hero, you know that. The woman met her gaze, her eyes sharp with the truth she didn't need to voice. Hero wasn't enough. She was a force, a creator, a woman who'd turned anguish into power. As Malik's tiny breath steadied against her chest, she felt the weight of her victory settle into her bones. The storm had passed, but she was just beginning. Don't miss the next chapter of this riveting saga. Subscribe to our channel for the latest updates and share where you're tuning in from. How will she transform this pain into a legacy of strength? Stay with us to witness her rise. The storm had dwindled to a faint drizzle, its once raging clamor now a soft murmur against the sleek black Bentley idling outside the New Orleans hospital. The vehicle's polished exterior gleamed under the streetlights, a stark contrast to the chaos of the delivery room left behind. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive leather and a trace of jasmine perfume, a fragrance that clung to Clara Vance, the CEO of a luxury fashion empire. Her blonde hair, swept into an impeccable chignon, framed a face that was all sharp angles and calculated charm. She sat in the back, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of champagne in her manicured hand, her crimson dress a bold slash of color against the car's muted interior. Her presence was a magnet, commanding attention with every measured gesture, every carefully chosen word. Beside her, Ethan Walsh slid into the plush seat, his tailored suit slightly damp from the rain, but his demeanor alight with a self-assured grin. The hospital, his wife, and the child she was birthing were already fading from his mind, replaced by the intoxicating promise of the world Clara offered. He'd left behind the woman he'd called a burden, her labor pains and her pleas irrelevant against the allure of this new life. Clara's voice, smooth as velvet but edged with steel, broke the silence. You made the right choice, Ethan, she said, her eyes flicking over him, assessing, approving. This is where you belong. He nodded, his chest swelling with the validation he'd craved, the sense that he was finally stepping into a realm that matched his ambitions. The Bentley pulled away from the curb, gliding through the rain-slicked streets, the city's lights blurring into streaks of gold and neon. Ethan leaned back, letting the soft leather cradle him, his mind racing with visions of penthouses, private jets, and boardrooms where his name would carry weight. Clara sipped her champagne, her gaze fixed on the window, but her words were directed at him, each one a hook sinking deeper. You've been wasting your potential, she said, her tone matter-of-fact, as if stating an indisputable truth. That life, those small dreams, that ordinary existence was holding you back. I see more in you. A place at the table, Ethan, where decisions shape empires. Her words were a siren's call, and Ethan drank them in, his ego fed by the promise of a future, unburdened by the woman he'd left behind. He thought of her, briefly, her face contorted in pain as he'd walked out, his arm around Clara. The memory was fleeting, dismissed as easily as he'd dismissed her. I'm ready, he said, his voice firm, eager. I've always known I was meant for more. Clara's lips curved, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Good, she said, her tone clipped. Because I don't tolerate mediocrity. You'll need to prove you're worth my investment. The car turned onto a boulevard lined with magnolia trees, their blooms ghostly in the dim light. Ethan barely noticed, his mind consumed by the image Clara painted. A life of influence, where money was no object, where his name would open doors. He didn't see the subtle shift in her expression, the way her eyes narrowed slightly, appraising him like a chess piece moved into position. To him, she was the key to a world he'd always coveted, a world where he could shed the constraints of his past, including the wife he'd deemed too small for his ambitions. Her blackness, her quiet strength, her dreams he'd mocked as unattainable, they were anchors he'd cut loose, believing they tethered him to a lesser life. Clara's phone buzzed and she glanced at it, her fingers swift as she typed a response. Ethan caught a glimpse of the screen. A name he recognized, a titan in the fashion world, someone whose influence dwarfed even Clara's. She set the phone down, her movements deliberate, and turned to him. "You understand what's at stake, don't you?" she asked, her voice low, almost a challenge. "This isn't just a job. It's a transformation. You're stepping into a world where only the exceptional survive." Her words carried a weight that prickled his skin, a reminder that her favor came with conditions. He nodded, his confidence unwavering. "I can handle it," he said, his tone brimming with bravado. The Bentley slowed as it approached a private club, its facade all dark glass and understated elegance, a haven for the city's elite. Clara's driver opened the door and she stepped out, her heels clicking against the wet pavement with a rhythm that demanded attention. Ethan followed, his stride matching hers, though he felt a flicker of unease at the way the doorman's eyes lingered on her, barely acknowledging him. Inside the club was a world of opulence, crystal chandeliers casting soft light, velvet drapes framing tall windows, the murmur of conversation from men and women who moved with the ease of those accustomed to power. Clara navigated it effortlessly, her presence drawing nods and smiles, while Ethan trailed behind, soaking in the grandeur. She led him to a private booth, its leather seats plush and inviting. A waiter appeared, placing a bottle of champagne on the table without a word, his deference reserved for Clara alone. Ethan felt a pang of something, envy perhaps, or the dawning realization that he was an accessory in her world, not yet a player. Clara poured him a glass, her movements graceful but calculated. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass, her eyes locked on his. He clinked his against hers, the sound sharp in the quiet booth. "To leave the past behind," he added, his voice firm, though a shadow of his wife's face flickered in his mind, quickly banished. Clara's smile was a blade, sharp and fleeting. "The past has a way of lingering if you're not careful," she said, her tone cool, almost warning. Ethan laughed, brushing it off, but her words planted a seed of doubt. She leaned back, her gaze piercing. "You left a life that was beneath you," she said, her voice low, laced with an edge that hinted at her own biases. "A life tied to someone who couldn't match your potential." The implication was clear, a subtle jab at his wife's blackness, her supposed limits, echoing the prejudices he'd internalized without question. He nodded, eager to align himself with Clara's vision, blind to the trap he was stepping into. The club's ambiance wrapped around them, a cocoon of wealth and ambition. But Ethan didn't see the way Clara's eyes flickered with calculation, sizing him up as a tool, not a partner. He was too caught up in the promise of her world, too intoxicated by the idea that he'd escaped the small life he'd left behind in that hospital room. He didn't know that the woman he'd abandoned was forging a legacy that would eclipse his dreams, a $75 billion fund that would reshape the world he thought he was entering. As Clara sipped her champagne, her smile was a mask, and Ethan, blind to its edges, believed he'd won. Don't miss the next chapter of this gripping tale. Subscribe to our channel for the latest updates and share where you're tuning in from. What lies ahead for Ethan in Clara's world, and how will his choices unravel? Stay with us to find out. The Atlanta night was alive with the pulse of wealth, the air thick with the scent of aged whiskey and designer perfume as the city's elite gathered in a glittering ballroom. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, casting prisms of light across polished marble floors, where waiters in crisp vests wove through the crowd like silent specters. 2 weeks had passed since the storm-swept night in New Orleans, and Ethan Walsh stood at the heart of this opulent gala, his tailored tuxedo a perfect fit, his arm loosely linked with Clara Vance's. Her crimson gown clung to her like a second skin, her blonde hair gleaming under the lights, every step a performance of power. Ethan basked in the reflected glow, his chest puffed with the certainty that he'd traded up, left behind a life too small for his ambitions. The hospital room, his wife's pained face, her desperate pleas, they were shadows he'd banished, replaced by the dazzle of this new world. Clara moved through the room like a queen, her smile a calculated weapon, drawing nods from moguls and murmurs from socialites. Ethan followed, his grin wide, relishing the envious glances that trailed them. He felt elevated, untouchable, as if the weight of his past had been shed like a cheap suit. The memory of his wife, her dark eyes burning with resolve as he'd walked out, was a fleeting ghost, dismissed with a sip of champagne. Clara leaned close, her voice a low purr. "This is your stage now, Ethan. Don't disappoint me." Her words were both promise and warning, and he nodded, eager to prove himself worthy of her world, blind to the strings she held. The ballroom buzzed with anticipation, the crowd's chatter a symphony of power plays and whispered deals. Ethan caught fragments, mergers, acquisitions, names that carried weight in boardrooms across the country. He felt like he belonged, like he'd finally stepped into the life he was meant for. Clara's hand brushed his arm, a subtle claim, and he stood taller, his ego fed by the attention. A photographer approached, his lens trained on them. "Ms. Vance, Mr. Walsh, this way." Ethan slipped his arm around her waist, the flash capturing his self-satisfied smile. He liked the sound of his name beside hers, the way it rolled off the tongue like a title. This was his moment, his ascension. The music softened, a delicate shift that hushed the room. The master of ceremonies, a silver-haired man in a tailored suit, took the stage, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to tonight's most significant announcement." Ethan sipped his champagne, only half listening, his mind on the deals he imagined brokering in Clara's orbit. The crowd stilled, their focus shifting to the massive screens that flanked the room. The MC's voice swelled with pride. "We celebrate a historic achievement, a $75 billion community investment fund that will redefine opportunity across our nation. Please join me in honoring the new CEO of the Global Prosperity Fund, a visionary leader who made this possible." Ethan's glass paused at his lips, a flicker of curiosity sparking. That figure, $75 billion, was staggering, even in this room of millionaires and billionaires. The screens lit up, and his breath caught, the champagne nearly slipping from his hand. Her face filled the displays, radiant and commanding, her dark eyes sharp with a confidence he'd never seen. His wife, his ex-wife, stood in a pristine white suit, her curly hair pulled back, her presence undeniable. The crowd erupted in applause, a thunderous wave that drowned out the music, cameras flashing as she stepped onto the stage, her stride steady, her smile a quiet triumph. Ethan's heart pounded, his mind reeling. The woman he'd called a burden, the one he'd left writhing in a hospital bed, was now the centerpiece of this glittering world. The MC's voice cut through his shock. "Her leadership has forged the largest community-focused partnership in our history, a testament to vision and tenacity." The words were a slow burn, each one a reminder of the dreams he'd dismissed, the ambition he'd mocked as beyond her reach. He remembered her late nights, the phone calls she'd taken in hushed tones, the files she'd guarded so fiercely. He thought them trivial, the hobbies of a woman who couldn't possibly play in his league. Now the truth was inescapable, projected larger than life for all to see. Clara stood beside him, her expression unreadable, her champagne glass steady in her hand. She didn't clap, didn't join the standing ovation that swept the room. Her eyes, sharp as a blade, flicked to Ethan, and he felt the weight of her scrutiny, a silent question he couldn't answer. The crowd's whispers reached him, praise for her brilliance, her courage, her ability to rise above. One guest, a white man in a pinstripe suit, leaned close, his voice low but clear. "Remarkable, isn't she? You'd never expect someone like her to pull this off." The words, laced with subtle prejudice, stung Ethan, not because they were cruel, but because they echoed his assumptions, the ones he'd carried when he'd walked away. His wife's face on the screen was a mirror, reflecting his failure. She wasn't just a success, she was a phenomenon, her name now synonymous with power. The MC continued, detailing the fund's impact, its reach into communities long overlooked. Ethan's mind flashed to their old apartment, her desk cluttered with notes he'd never bothered to read, her quiet determination he'd mistaken for insignificance. He'd seen her blackness as a limit, her dreams as too big for her reality. Now the world saw her as a titan, and he was just a man in a borrowed tuxedo, clinging to Clara's coattails. Clara's voice broke his reverie, cool and measured. "Looks like you underestimated her," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. Ethan turned, his throat dry, searching for a response, but her eyes were already elsewhere, scanning the room for her next move. The implication was clear. She'd known about this deal, this triumph, while he'd been blind, too consumed by his ambition to see the truth. The guest beside him murmured again, "She's a rarity, isn't she? Breaking through like that." The words meant as praise carried a sting, a reminder of the barriers she'd shattered, barriers he'd assumed she'd never overcome. The applause faded, the program moving on, but Ethan's world had shifted. His champagne glass sat forgotten on the table, the liquid pooling where it had spilled. Clara's hand rested lightly on his arm, but it felt like a chain, a reminder that he was tethered to her whims. The ballroom, once a symbol of his ascent, now felt suffocating, its grandeur mocking his miscalculation. He'd traded a woman who'd built an empire for a fleeting promise, and the weight of that choice pressed down on him, heavy as the storm that had raged 2 weeks ago. The screens dimmed, but her image lingered in his mind, a beacon of what he'd lost. He stood frozen, the crowd's chatter a distant hum, as Clara leaned close, her voice a whisper. "Don't let the past distract you, Ethan. You're here now." But her words were a hollow echo, and for the first time he wondered if he'd stepped into a trap dressed as a throne. Don't miss the next chapter of this electrifying story. Subscribe to our channel for the latest updates and share where you're tuning in from. How will Ethan face the consequences of his choices? Stay with us to witness the unraveling. The Atlanta skyline shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Clara Vance's penthouse, a constellation of lights that mocked the dimness settling over Ethan Walsh's world. 3 weeks had passed since the gala, where his ex-wife's face had blazed across the screens. Her $75 billion triumph, a searing rebuke to his betrayal. The memory of her, radiant in a white suit, commanding the room as the new CEO of the Global Prosperity Fund, haunted him, a ghost he couldn't banish. He sat on a sleek leather couch in Clara's opulent apartment, the air heavy with the scent of her jasmine perfume and the faint metallic tang of his unease. The luxury that once thrilled him, marble countertops, abstract art worth millions, now felt like a cage, its walls closing in with each passing day. Clara, resplendent in a tailored silk blouse, moved through the space with the grace of a predator, her blonde hair catching the light as she poured herself a glass of wine. Her demeanor had shifted since the gala, her warmth replaced by a cool detachment that left Ethan on edge. She no longer invited him to her high-profile meetings, her invitations to dinners and events dwindling to clipped instructions and vague promises. "You need to earn your place," she'd said last week, her tone sharp, her eyes dismissing him as if he were a hired hand. Tonight she barely acknowledged him, her focus on her phone, her fingers tapping out messages to names he recognized as players far above his reach. He was no longer her partner in ambition, he was a prop, one she could discard when it no longer served her. Ethan's mind churned, replaying the gala's aftermath. The headlines had been relentless. His ex-wife's name splashed across every major outlet. Visionary leader redefines community investment. A new era of prosperity. Her face, once familiar in their modest New Orleans apartment, now stared out from newsstands and screens, a symbol of resilience and power. He'd seen the whispers at the gala, the subtle jabs from guests who'd noted her blackness, with a mix of awe and condescension, as if her success were an anomaly. One had said, She's remarkable considering her background. The words a backhanded compliment that echoed Ethan's past assumptions. He'd believed her dreams too big, her world too small, and now the irony was a blade in his chest. She was the titan, and he was the fool. He stood, pacing to the window, the city sprawling below like a map of missed opportunities. Clara's voice cut through the silence, cool and deliberate. "You're distracted again, Ethan. That's becoming a habit." He turned, forcing a smile, but her eyes were unyielding, assessing him like a commodity whose value was slipping. "I'm focused," he lied, his voice strained. "Just adjusting." She raised an eyebrow, her lips curving in a smile that held no warmth. "Adjust faster," she said, her tone a warning. "I don't carry dead weight." The words landed like a blow, and he saw it then, the truth he'd ignored. Clara's world was a chessboard, and he was a pawn, useful only as long as he served her strategy. The realization drove him to act. He left the penthouse that night, the air crisp with the promise of autumn, and drove through Atlanta's quiet streets to a place he'd visited only once before, a sprawling estate on the city's outskirts. The property, once a barren lot his ex-wife had dreamed of transforming, now stood as a testament to her vision. White stone walls, manicured gardens, a driveway curving around a fountain that gleamed under security lights. The iron gates loomed, their presence both imposing and final, a barrier he'd never thought he'd face. He clutched a bouquet of roses, their petals a desperate offering, and pressed the intercom, his heart pounding with a mix of shame and hope. The speaker crackled, and her voice came through, calm but edged with steel. "What do you want?" The question was a wall, unyielding, and he faltered, his rehearsed words crumbling. "It's me," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I need to see you. Please." A long silence followed, each second stretching his nerves taut, until the gates hummed open, their movements slow and deliberate, like a judgment. He drove through, the roses trembling in his grip, the estate's grandeur a stark reminder of how far she'd risen while he'd fallen. She stood in the doorway of the mansion, her son cradled on her hip, his tiny hand clutching her sweater. Her presence was different now, stronger, sharper, her dark eyes unreadable as they fixed on him. The woman he'd left in that hospital room, racked with pain and betrayal, was gone, replaced by someone who commanded the space around her. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice steady, devoid of the warmth he'd once taken for granted. He held out the roses, his throat tight. "I came to apologize," he said, the words spilling out in a rush. "Clara, she's done with me. I was wrong. I see that now." Her gaze didn't soften, her expression a fortress he couldn't breach. "Wrong?" she echoed, her tone cutting. "You didn't make a mistake, Ethan. You made a choice. You walked out on your wife and child in the middle of labor because you thought I was less than her." The roses felt heavy in his hands, their petals wilting under the weight of her words. He remembered the gala, her image on the screens, the crowd's awe, and the guest who'd whispered, "She's extraordinary for someone like her." The prejudice in those words mirrored in his actions burned now, a truth he couldn't escape. "I want to make it right," he said, stepping closer, his voice pleading. "For you, for him." He glanced at their son, the boy's wide eyes meeting his, and felt a pang of loss so sharp it stole his breath. She shifted the child in her arms, her posture protective, unyielding. "You think this is about fixing things?" she said, her voice low but fierce. "You left us when I was at my weakest, Ethan. I didn't just survive, I thrived without you." Her words were a mirror, reflecting his failure, and he saw himself clearly. A man who'd traded a diamond for a mirage. She didn't take the roses. "You chose a world you thought was bigger," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But you never asked what I was building. You assumed I couldn't, because of who I am." The accusation, laced with the sting of racial prejudice he'd never acknowledged, hit like a wave. He opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "Our son will know you, but he'll also know what you did. And he'll learn that respect is earned, not owed." The finality in her voice was a door slamming shut, and he felt the weight of it, heavy as the gates behind him. She stepped back, the mansion's grand door closing with a deep, resonant thud. Ethan stood frozen, the roses slipping from his hand to the stone steps, their petals scattering in the evening breeze. The estate loomed around him, a monument to her victory, and he was an outsider, banished by his own choices. He turned to his car, the city's lights distant and cold, the realization settling in. He lost everything, not because of her, but because of himself. Don't miss the final chapter of this gripping saga. Subscribe to our channel for the latest updates and share where you're tuning in from. Will Ethan find redemption, or is his fall complete? Stay with us to witness the end. The Atlanta evening draped the city in a velvet hush, the skyline a tapestry of twinkling lights that seemed to celebrate the woman who stood in her mansion's sunlit living room. Adwoa Owusu, in her early 30s, a badge of unyielding resilience, cradled her son Malik, his chubby fingers tugging at her cream sweater as he babbled softly. The estate, a vision she'd once sketched on a napkin in a cramped apartment, was now a reality. White stone walls, tall glass windows, and gardens that bloomed with defiance. The iron gates that had closed behind Ethan Walsh, her ex-husband, stood as a sentinel, guarding the life she'd built from the ashes of his betrayal. The memory of his visit, his wilted roses, and his hollow apologies lingered like a faint echo, but Adwoa's focus was forward, her heart tethered to the future she was forging for herself and her son. The living room was a haven of warmth, its hardwood floors gleaming under soft light, toys scattered like tiny monuments to Malik's joy. Adwoa set him down, watching as he crawled toward a stack of colorful blocks, his laughter a melody that soothed the scars of the past. She moved to the kitchen, the bouquet Ethan had left still clutched in her hand. The roses, once vibrant, were beginning to droop, their petals a fragile reminder of his failed attempt at redemption. She filled a vase with water, placing the flowers inside, not out of sentiment, but because she believed in transforming even the discarded into something useful. It was a principle that defined her, a refusal to let pain or betrayal dictate her path. As the water caught the light, she thought of the $75 billion community investment fund she'd secured, a legacy born in secrecy and now celebrated across the nation. The television hummed in the background, a news anchor's voice cutting through the quiet. Adwoa Owusu, the visionary behind the Global Prosperity Fund, continues to redefine what's possible, the anchor said, her image flashing on the screen. Adwoa, in her white suit, her smile a quiet declaration of power. The words were a balm, a confirmation of her triumph over the doubts that had dogged her. She remembered the boardroom skeptics, their veiled comments about her background, the way they'd raised eyebrows when she, a black woman, dared to dream bigger than their expectations. One executive had said, "Your passion is admirable, but are you sure you're ready for this scale?" Her response had been a masterclass in precision, dismantling their bias with facts and foresight. That victory, sealed in the hospital room's chaos, was now her crown. Malik's giggle pulled her back, his tiny hands toppling a tower of blocks. She knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his curls, and whispered, "You'll learn to build, not break, my love." Her voice was steady, a vow woven with the strength she'd honed through betrayal. Ethan's words in that hospital room, "You're nothing but a burden, dragging me down with your small life," had been a weapon, but she'd turned them into fuel. She thought of the gala, her face on those screens, the crowd's applause, a thunderous affirmation. The memory of Ethan's shock, his champagne glass slipping, was a fleeting satisfaction, overshadowed by the pride of her achievement. She hadn't needed his validation then, and she didn't need it now. Outside, the evening breeze stirred the gardens, the fountain's gentle ripple a counterpoint to the city's distant hum. Adwoa's phone buzzed, a message from her team outlining the next phase of her fund. A program to empower Black women entrepreneurs, a $500 million initiative to seed dreams like hers. She smiled, not with pride, but with purpose, knowing each dollar would ripple through communities, breaking cycles of doubt and exclusion. The world had tried to box her in, neighbors who'd called her articulate with surprise, colleagues who'd assumed her ambition was a fluke. Even Ethan, with his prejudiced dismissal, had seen her as less, his choice to leave a reflection of his limitations. But she was boundless, her vision a beacon that outshone their narrow gaze. Across the city, Ethan sat in his car, parked on a quiet street, the radio crackling with the same news broadcast. Edwoa Owusu, a trailblazer who's overcome every obstacle, the anchor said, and Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The penthouse he'd shared with Clara was a memory now, her cold dismissal. "You're not indispensable, Ethan." A final cut that had severed their tie. She'd moved on, her attention shifted to fresher prospects, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his hubris. He'd driven past Adwoa's estate again, the gates unyielding, her voice on the intercom a wall he couldn't breach. The roses he'd left were gone, likely swept away, a symbol of his failure to reclaim what he'd discarded. He turned off the radio, the silence heavy with regret. The city's lights, once a promise of glory, now mocked him, their brilliance a reminder of Adwoa's ascent. He saw her now, not as the woman he'd left in pain, but as the force she'd become, her name a headline, her legacy a monument. He'd traded her for Clara's fleeting allure, believing her world was bigger, better. But Clara's world was a mirage, a game of power where he was a pawn, discarded when his utility waned. Edwoa's world was real, built on grit and vision, and he was outside it, a stranger to the life he'd once shared. Back in the mansion, Adwoa lifted Malik, his warmth grounding her as she moved to the window. The garden stretched before her, a canvas of possibilities she'd painted from nothing. She thought of the lessons she'd teach her son, that respect is earned through action, that love is a choice to stay, that strength is not just surviving, but thriving. The news anchor's voice faded, replaced by her thoughts, a quiet resolve to keep building. Her fund wasn't just money, it was a promise, a bridge for those who'd been told their dreams were too big. She'd faced that doubt, from Ethan, from boardrooms, from a world that saw her skin before her soul, and she'd proven them wrong. The vase of roses sat on the counter, their petals catching the light, a reminder that even betrayal could be repurposed. Adwoa didn't need revenge. Her life was her victory, each step a defiance of the limits others had tried to impose. She kissed Malik's forehead, his eyes bright with the innocence she'd protect. "We're more than enough," she whispered, her voice a soft vow. Outside, the city pulsed, but here, in this moment, she was complete, her heart a fortress, her future a flame. Ethan drove away, the road stretching empty before him, his regrets a weight he couldn't shed. Edwoa stood tall, her son in her arms, her vision clear. The world would know her name, not as a victim, but as a victor, a woman who'd turned anguish into a radiant triumph. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories and share where you're tuning in from. What new heights will Adwoa reach, and what lessons will her legacy teach? Stay with us to explore more tales of resilience and redemption. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey through Adwoa Owusu's story of betrayal, resilience, and radiant triumph. Her rise from the pain of abandonment to a trailblazing leader is a testament to the strength within us all. We hope this tale has moved you, sparked reflection, or inspired you to defy the odds in your own life. What did Adwoa's journey mean to you? Did her courage resonate, or did Ethan's choices stir your thoughts? Share your feelings in the comments below and let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear your voice. Your support fuels our storytelling, so subscribe to catch more tales of grit and glory. Thank you for being part of our community, and we can't wait to meet you again in the next chapter. Until then, keep shining, keep dreaming, and stay unstoppable.